1 million Armenians were killed in 7 or 8 months in 1915. 1 million Armenians just in that period. That was unprecedented in modern history.
The Armenians were not Turkic, the Armenians were Christian.
They've been wanting to get rid of this minority for a long time, and now was their chance under the cover of war.
The whole Armenian population, they were all arrested and massacred on deportation marches.
They have the same PR company that does tobacco industry stuff and anti-global warming stuff.
The US government, out of deference to our NATO ally, Turkey, had a taboo on saying anything about this historical event.
Hey everybody, welcome to What the Flick. Christy Alonso, new documentary opening, partially about the Armenian Genocide and partially about the making of a movie about the Armenian Genocide that came out a while ago called The Promise, which I never saw.
I saw The Promise, and I can attest that this documentary, the Joe Berlinger documentary about The Promise, is more interesting than The Promise.
Gotcha.
Yes,
so what's this?
It's called Intent to Destroy, and it is about the making of this movie called The Promise, which Terry George directed, Robin Swicord wrote. It was a romance set against the backdrop of the Armenian Genocide. It was a love triangle between Oscar Isaac and Charlotte Le Bon and Christian Bale. And this is about how hard it was to get that made for a lot of reasons, most of which have to do with Turkey's denial that there even was an Armenian genocide and how they had to make it elsewhere. But then Joe Berlinger also encompasses within the story of that filmmaking process just what exactly has happened throughout the years with the Armenian genocide and the denial that has gone on and the pressure that people like Adam Agoyan have been put under as filmmakers. So it is a big story through this smaller prism, and it's pretty fascinating. Take a look.
If we could go and shoot in Turkey, we'd go do that. It's impossible.
Our hope is to replicate the events, but not make it repulsive, because the events really were.
Genocide is ultimately about erasure, and denial is a way of sealing that erasure.
It's not just about them admitting it, it's about justice. We want justice.
The onus of telling that story. I mean, the soul of the whole Armenian nation is burnt by this.
I think I'm more interested in the story than in the prism. Like, I think the movie does a really great job, a somewhat academic job, but of basically sort of like explaining the Armenian Genocide and what was the Ottoman Empire and World War I and all the things that went into it.
There are maps.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. There's some footage I think from the 70s of like survivors telling their stories, but there are not a ton of that. And then talking about sort of the history of Turkey using its influence to enforce this denial. MGM was going to make a movie of this novel about it in the 30s, and it basically told them that not only would that movie be banned in Turkey, but like all American movies would be banned in Turkey if you make this film. So they didn't make it. And then Adam Agoyan making Ararat, and getting all this stuff and having just being libeled by the government about it over his entire career. And
that was chilling to me. Yeah. That the Turkish government put out this book, this propaganda against Adam Agoyan, trying to tear him down as a filmmaker, and like looking at the box office grosses of all of his previous films. It gave people talking points as to what to do.
And how the Sweet Hereafter getting Oscar nominations was part of some conspiracy, blah, blah, blah.
Oh yeah, they call him a terrorist. Adam Agoyan is considered a cultural terrorist.
Cultural terrorist, that's right.
It's scary, yeah.
So, this is an interesting story, and Berlinger tells it in an okay way. It's talking heads and it's footage and it's maps and it's whatever. But then when they keep cutting back to the making of The Promise, it all kind of grinds to a halt. And they really, because they just get so into the minutia of just the making of this one movie, as opposed to this larger story that they have to tell. It felt to me like that it was becoming this would be a great DVD extra with The Promise, but as somebody who hadn't seen The Promise and who never got around to it because everything I heard about it was that it was not that great.
It's not that great.
It feels to me like, you could, I think there was a way to make that your sort of touchstone without coming back to it over and over again, because that's the least interesting part of everything that's being told here.
I feel like that was a good point of entry to a topic that could seem potentially daunting and like an eat your vegetables kind of topic. Like, yeah, it's a documentary about the Armenian Genocide, which does not sound like a whole lot of fun. But if it's through this prism, again, of this filmmaking process about a movie that just came out, it was like last year. It was very recent, The Promise came out. That felt to me like a better access point. And I was interested in how they got this made, how they had to go elsewhere, how they had to do a lot of it secretly, and just also the process of trying to get this really, really right and really tell this story, and how Terry George, of all the directors in all the world, seemed particularly suited to telling the story because he had made Hotel Rwanda.
Right.
That was what, 2004, I want to say. And so he has told a story about something really horrific, something that's hard to get your arms around, and yet do it in a cinematic way that's also impactful. The problem I had with The Promise was it's really well made and it's well acted and it's, I mean, undeniably well intentioned, but it's kind of boring, right? Because the romance at the center of it is not nearly as interesting as just the turmoil, the geopolitical turmoil that is going on around them. So like, I don't care who Charlotte LeBon picks. If she picks Oscar Isaac, who is also Armenian, or she picks Christian Bale, who is the photojournalist, the shit-stirring journalist from the Associated Press, actually. He's a real guy, Chris something.
I don't know.
He was a real guy. The AP did a story about him.
I think that's kind of how I felt about this one. It was sort of like I didn't care about The Promise, and like if you're right, as a starting point, that would have been a total like, here's Terry George trying to make this movie. Why is it so hard to make this movie? Well, let me tell you. Sure, but then to keep like every time they would cut back to it, and they cut back, like I'd say a good third of this movie at least is devoted to B-roll, behind the scenes footage of The Promise.
It was a long shoot.
And talks to people involved with the making of the film, and it was kind of like, could we just get back to the actual story we're telling here? Because it is an ongoing thing. The US government has yet to acknowledge that it happens. Obama said he was gonna, and then he got into power, and suddenly, whoops, nope, not talking about it because Turkey has this very strategic,
crucial spot.
Iraq adjacent, area on the map, and
Syria adjacent.
Oh, that's
they are a buffer zone from Syria.
Exactly. So it's like, this is a really compelling story. I don't care about this movie that people didn't like and that everyone has already forgotten existed, and we keep coming back to it, and so that sucked the energy out of this film for me.
Having said that, though, it does not hurt, I think, to keep telling this story over and over again. Given that like there is still, 100 years plus, there is still like massive denial.
And then I was surprised they didn't talk about that Russell Crowe movie with The Water Diviner or whatever.
I don't remember that.
The one he directed, where they just sort of like blithely kind of ignore it because I think he made it in Turkey with the Turkish government's assistance. So it's set right after World War I, but no one talks about Armenians at all. I didn't see that one either, but that was the take that I heard from a lot of folks.
Interesting. Were you in town the day of the 100-year march in town?
Oh yeah, trying to get here that morning was like a lot of Armenian flags out of a lot of windows.
Coming down Wilshire, like all of Wilshire was stopped. So definitely making their voices heard and necessarily so.
So yeah, we didn't talk about The Promise because I think Christy was the only person who saw it. There was no grand conspiracy about this network and not talking about the Armenian Genocide. We're talking about the Armenian Genocide.
Yeah, The Promise just kind of came and went, and it wasn't great. It's well made,
and well intentioned for sure. I'm sure.
Yes. So my number is a 7. It gets its arms around a lot of a complicated topic through various perspectives, and I thought it was pretty good.
I'll say 6 because it does take a big chunk of history and streamline it in a pretty good way, even if there's nothing particularly exciting about the documentary style that, and Berlinger has, this is the guy who did like the Paradise Lost trilogy, like he's
the Metallica documentary, which is so great.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, this is kind of stayed for him.
True.
And I wish there hadn't been so much about The Promise.
True. Okay, so our number is then
6.5.
6.5. Okay, and is it 100% on the tomato meter? So if you're interested, go check it out.
Yeah, it's not like there's a ton of other movies on this topic, so knock yourself out.
Bye.